Subscribe now, because what you're about to read will prove that sometimes it takes another man's attention to make you see what you've had all along. A 38-year-old billionaire developer who spent 5 years treating his architect wife like furniture in their penthouse watches her walk into his company anniversary party in a red dress that stops traffic and suddenly realizes every other man in the room sees what he's been too blind to notice. She's brilliant, building her own reputation in sustainable architecture while he's been chasing deals. He's been dismissive, absent, emotionally unavailable for years. She chose that dress deliberately, a test to see if he'd even look her way. This story has a husband watching his wife laugh with a younger architect and feeling jealousy for the first time in years. The slow, painful realization that his professional success came at the cost of his marriage. A long night of honest conversation that might be too late, and an ending that proves the hardest business deal you'll ever negotiate is earning back the love you took for granted. Don't miss how one red dress, one party, and one moment of clarity can change everything. Bruno Wojciechowski stood at the window of his spacious office on the 30th floor of a Chicago high-rise. The autumn sun reflected off the glass facades of surrounding buildings, casting warm light on the minimalist interior. He was a billionaire whose fortune exceeded $2 billion, but his face expressed no satisfaction. He'd spent 38 years of his life building a business empire that now included a chain of hotels across the Midwest, a development firm, and stakes in several tech startups. His phone vibrated on the desk. He glanced at the screen. A message from Eva, his wife of 5 years. "Remember tonight's party? Leaving at 6 p.m. Bruno sighed heavily. He didn't respond. Their marriage had long resembled a business arrangement more than a relationship based on love. They'd met at a charity gala in Milwaukee. She was a 26-year-old architecture graduate with ambitions. He was a successful entrepreneur. At first, Eva fascinated him with her intelligence, natural charm, and passion for designing sustainable urban spaces. They married after a year of dating in a small church in northern Wisconsin, where Eva's family came from. Bruno still remembered how sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows that day, illuminating her face surrounded by light blonde hair, now pulled back in a practical ponytail. Back then, he truly thought they'd be happy. Footsteps echoed in the corridor. His assistant, Caroline, knocked gently on the door. "Mr. President, you have a video conference with investors from Singapore in 15 minutes. Her voice was professional but warm. "Thank you, Caroline. Remind me what time I have the board meeting tomorrow." 9 a.m., conference room on the 20th floor. Bruno nodded, and his thoughts returned to Eva. When exactly had he stopped paying attention to her? Maybe when her projects started gaining recognition in the industry, or when he began spending more and more time on business trips. The truth was that after the wedding, he quickly returned to his old rhythm: 14-hour workdays, weekends spent analyzing reports, constant phone calls, and video conferences. Eva initially tried to adapt. She organized dinners, planned vacations together, showed interest in his projects. But Bruno increasingly saw her as an obstacle to achieving his professional plans. Her desire for shared life, conversations, closeness, it all seemed like a waste of time to him. Gradually they drifted apart, living under one roof like two strangers. That evening, Bruno reluctantly returned to their Wilmette penthouse to prepare for the company party his firm was hosting at one of Chicago's most expensive hotels. It was to be the event of the year, celebrating the 20th anniversary of founding his first company. He'd invited the most important business partners, politicians, celebrities, and influencers. Everything was buttoned up perfectly. When he entered the bedroom, he stopped in the doorway. The delicate scent of Eva's perfume hung in the air, a composition of rose and musk that he once loved. The bathroom was empty, but on the bed lay a dress he'd never seen before. Short, elegant, in deep red, with delicate crystal appliques at the neckline. Bruno frowned. This dress definitely didn't fit the image of Eva that had formed in his mind in recent years. A practical, understated woman who most often wore comfortable but elegant suits or simple dresses in neutral colors. This red was too bold, too eye-catching. It didn't fit the role of the CEO's wife, always standing a step behind him. "Eva!" he called, but silence answered him. He glanced at his watch. It was approaching 7 p.m. The party started at 8, and he still needed to shower and change into his, tuxedo. He didn't have time to think about his wife's wardrobe. He walked to the closet and pulled out a carefully pressed white shirt. Half an hour later, as he was tying his bow tie in front of the mirror, he heard the sound of the door opening. Eva had returned, but she didn't enter the bedroom. Bruno sighed and finished tying the bow tie, then stepped into the hallway. "Are you ready? We need to leave in 15 minutes, he said without looking at her, busy checking messages on his phone. "Yes, I'm ready." Something in her voice made him look up and freeze. Eva stood before him in that red dress, which perfectly emphasized her slender figure. Her hair, usually tied back, now fell freely on her shoulders in soft golden waves. Delicate makeup highlighted her large blue eyes and full lips. Bruno felt his heart accelerate. For a moment he saw her as he had on their wedding day, a radiant, confident woman who once made him lose his head. But now there was something more in her. A maturity he hadn't noticed before, a certain kind of independence that intrigued him. "What happened?" Eva asked, seeing his look. "Don't you like the dress?" Bruno cleared his throat, trying to hide his sudden confusion. "It's not appropriate. We should go." On the way to the hotel, they sat in silence. Bruno drove his black Mercedes through Chicago's congested streets, occasionally glancing surreptitiously at his wife. The lights of passing street lamps illuminated her profile, reflected in her hair. He noticed she was playing nervously with her wedding ring, a habit she'd had since the beginning of their marriage. "Who will be at the party?" she asked suddenly, breaking the silence. "All the important people in the industry. A delegation from Germany. Carl Wysocki from Property Development, the Secretary of Transportation." Bruno began listing names, returning to the safe ground of business talk. "Will Michael Nowicki be there too?" Eva asked, looking through the window. Bruno looked at her sharply. Michael was a young architect whose firm had recently begun collaborating with Eva's practice on a sustainable housing development project. "I don't remember. Why do you ask?" His voice was colder than he'd intended. Eva shrugged slightly. "Just asking. We talked recently about possible collaboration on a new project in Milwaukee." Bruno felt a stab of something he hadn't experienced in years. Jealousy. He suppressed the feeling, focusing on the road ahead. This is absurd, he thought. After all, he himself had ignored Eva for years, treating their marriage as an addition to his life, something that ranked second or third after work, after success, after money. When they pulled up to the hotel, Bruno tossed the keys to the valet and turned to wait for Eva. As she stepped out of the car in that red dress, she attracted the stares of passers-by and other guests heading to the party. Bruno felt a sudden need to walk over and put his arm around her, to make everyone understand that this beautiful woman was his wife. But he held back. Instead, following his habit of recent years, he headed first toward the entrance, assuming Eva would follow. This time, however, he was wrong. Bruno entered the hotel's elegant ballroom where dozens of people were already gathering. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light on marble floors and silk decorations in shades of silver and navy. Waiters in perfectly tailored uniforms circulated among guests, offering glasses of champagne and exquisite appetizers. In the background, a string quartet discreetly played classical compositions. Several business partners immediately approached Bruno, congratulating him on the company's anniversary. The director of one of the largest banks in Illinois clapped him on the shoulder, praising recent financial results. The Secretary of Transportation shook his hand, mentioning the possibility of collaboration on a new highway project. An investor from Germany praised his strategy for expanding into the Western market. Bruno accepted compliments with a practiced smile, while discreetly looking around for Eva. He didn't see her at the entrance, which was strange since they'd entered the building almost together. Usually at such events, she stayed close to him, standing quietly to the side, occasionally exchanging pleasantries with other businessmen's wives. Now, however, he didn't spot her anywhere. "Bruno, old friend." He heard a deep, familiar voice behind him. It was Andrew Kowalski, his former college roommate, currently running a competing development firm. 20 years is a long time. Who would have thought that skinny college student would grow into such a business shark? Bruno shook his hand, smiling genuinely for the first time that evening. Andrew always managed to break through his professional facade. "I could say the same about you," Bruno replied. "I heard you won the bid to build the new shopping center in Detroit." Andrew nodded, taking a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. We worked hard on that proposal, but enough about business. Where's your beautiful wife? I haven't seen Eva in a long time. Before Bruno could answer, his attention was caught by a burst of laughter coming from the other end of the room. Instinctively, he looked in that direction and froze. Eva stood among a group of young architects, including Michael Nowicki, that ambitious designer she'd mentioned in the car. In her red dress, she stood out like a flame among understated suits and dark dresses. Her face radiated joy as she animatedly gestured, telling something that clearly amused the company. Bruno couldn't take his eyes off her. When was the last time he'd seen her so animated, so full of energy? Had he ever made her laugh that way? Ah, I see her now, Andrew said, following his gaze. Eva's always been able to light up any room. I don't understand why you keep her locked up at home instead of showing her off to the world. Bruno looked at his friend with surprise. What do you mean? Andrew shrugged. Come on, Bruno. I see you at dozens of business events, always alone. It's a shame because Eva is not only beautiful but intelligent. I heard her sustainable housing projects are gaining more and more recognition. I recently read an article about her in Architecture and Design. Bruno felt a stab of unease. He didn't know about any article. In fact, for months he hadn't asked Eva about her work, assuming she was handling some small projects for local clients. Apparently her career was developing better than he'd suspected. Excuse me for a moment, he said to Andrew, and headed toward Eva, feeling growing nervousness. The closer he got, the more clearly he saw how much her expression had changed compared to their daily, cold interactions. Her eyes sparkled, her cheeks were covered with a delicate flush, and her lips formed a genuine smile. Bruno stopped a few steps from the group, watching as Michael Nowicki leaned slightly toward Eva, saying something quietly that provoked her laughter again. Michael must be about 30 years old. He was tall, slim, with dark hair swept back and an intelligent gaze. Bruno had heard of him as a rising star in the world of architecture, specializing in projects that combined modernity with sustainable solutions, exactly what Eva was passionate about. Finally, one of the architects noticed Bruno and discreetly nodded in his direction. Eva turned, and her smile faded slightly when their eyes met. Bruno, she said, straightening slightly. Let me introduce you to my collaborators. You probably already know some of them. She went through names one by one, but Bruno barely registered them, focusing on how freely Eva moved in this company, as if she were the hostess here, a confident professional, not just the billionaire's wife. And this is Michael Nowicki, lead architect on the Milwaukee project I mentioned to you, she concluded, indicating the man who'd been amusing her earlier. Michael extended his hand. It's an honor to finally meet you, Mr. Wojciechowski. Eva has told me a lot about you. Bruno squeezed his hand harder than intended. Really? That's interesting, because I've heard very little about you. An awkward silence fell. Eva frowned, and Michael coughed lightly, withdrawing his hand. Bruno, Michael and I are working on a concept for a development that combines your investment requirements with sustainable solutions. I told you about this a few weeks ago when I showed you the preliminary sketches, Eva said, a note of irritation appearing in her voice. Bruno didn't remember any sketches. He'd probably been taking an important call or reviewing documents, only partially paying attention to what his wife was saying. Of course, he lied smoothly. The project looks promising. Michael looked at him searchingly, as if sensing the falsehood. Eva has an extraordinary vision. Her idea of using local materials and traditional building techniques combined with the latest energy-saving technologies is revolutionary. The competition committee was extremely impressed. Competition committee? Bruno looked questioningly at Eva. Her cheeks flushed slightly. We submitted the project to an international competition called Green Architecture Future. We made it to the finals. I mentioned it at dinner last week. Bruno didn't remember any dinner last week. Had they even eaten together? He tried to recall where he'd been. Probably at a meeting with investors in Berlin, or at a business dinner with clients. Congratulations, he said stiffly, feeling growing embarrassment. How could he not know about something so important in his own wife's life? Eva looked at him for a moment, as if waiting for something more, but Bruno didn't know what he should say. Eventually she nodded and turned back to the group of architects. Excuse me, I need to borrow my husband for a moment, she said with a professional smile. Michael, we'll talk later about those revisions to the atrium project. She took Bruno's arm and gently but firmly led him toward a less crowded part of the room. "What was that supposed to be?" she asked quietly, when they were away from curious ears. "What do you mean?" Bruno tried to pretend he didn't understand. Eva sighed, and a shadow of sadness appeared in her eyes. "You're acting like you're jealous, which is absurd considering you've practically not noticed me for years." Her words hit Bruno harder than he expected. He wanted to deny it, but he knew she was right. How long had their marriage existed, only on paper? "That's not true," he said, more from habit of defending himself than conviction. Eva shook her head. "Bruno, we don't talk to each other. You don't ask about my work, my projects, my dreams. You don't even know that 3 months ago I got a nomination for Architect of the Year, though I left the invitation on your desk." Bruno wanted to say something, but at that moment, a waiter approached with a tray filled with champagne glasses. They both took one, using the moment to calm their emotions. "Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats," the room manager announced through a microphone. "The official part of the ceremony will begin in 15 minutes. Bruno and Eva looked at each other. They both knew this wasn't the end of the conversation, but now they had to play the role of the perfect couple, the CEO and his beautiful, supportive wife. They took their places at the main table. Bruno sat in the center with Eva on his right and the Secretary of Transportation on his left. Across from them sat German investors with their wives, and further along other important guests. Bruno noticed that Michael Nowicki had been seated several places away, within Eva's line of sight. When waiters began serving the first course, an exquisite lobster bisque, the secretary turned to Bruno with a question about the new project in Milwaukee. Bruno, who usually knew all the details of his investments, this time felt unprepared. This was the project Eva was working on with Michael, and he hadn't paid it any attention. "Perhaps my wife can tell you more," he said, indicating Eva. "She's the lead architect on this project." Eva looked at him, surprised. Bruno had never before publicly acknowledged her in such a role. Usually he spoke of his architects or his design team, never highlighting her as project manager. The secretary turned with interest to Eva, and she began, describing the concept of a development combining traditional Milwaukee architecture with modern sustainable solutions. She spoke with passion and professionalism, using specialist language, but in a way understandable to everyone at the table. Bruno observed how guests listened to her attentively and admiringly. Asking intelligent questions, she answered without hesitation. With each passing minute, Bruno realized more clearly how much he'd underestimated his wife. She was no longer the young, inexperienced architecture graduate he'd married 5 years ago. She'd become a confident expert, respected in the industry, with her own achievements and successes. When Eva finished discussing the project, the secretary turned to Bruno. "You're lucky to have such a wife. Not only beautiful, but extremely competent. Now, I understand why your projects always stand out from the competition." Bruno nodded, not knowing what to answer. For years he'd been accustomed to thinking of his successes as exclusively his own achievements. He'd never considered how much Eva might have contributed to them. After the first course came official speeches. Bruno stood to thank guests for attending and deliver a speech about his company's history, its achievements, and plans for the future. He spoke fluently, with the confidence he'd developed through years of public speaking. He mentioned his beginnings, the difficulties he'd overcome, key business decisions that brought him to the top. As he approached the end of his speech, his gaze rested on Eva. She sat upright with a champagne glass in her hand, looking at him with an expression he couldn't read, a mixture of pride, sadness, and something else that resembled resignation. And then, completely spontaneously, he changed the ending of his speech. "But there's one more person without whom I wouldn't be where I am today," he said, not taking his eyes off Eva. "My wife, Eva, who not only creates incredible projects for our firm, but also reminds me why I started all this, to build not just buildings, but places where people can live better, healthier, happier." Silence fell over the room. No one expected such an ending, least of all Eva, whose eyes widened with astonishment. "Please join me in a toast to Eva," Bruno added, raising his glass. All the guests stood, raising their glasses in a toast. Eva sat motionless for a moment, clearly surprised. then slowly stood, accepting congratulations with a delicate smile. But Bruno noticed she didn't look him in the eyes. When guests returned to their conversations and waiters began serving the main course, Bruno leaned toward Eva. "I was speaking honestly," he said quietly. "I'm sorry I haven't appreciated you enough." Eva looked at him, and in her eyes the light of crystal chandeliers reflected. "Those are the first words of recognition I've heard from you in years," she replied equally quietly. "Why now, Bruno? What changed?" Bruno wanted to answer, but they were interrupted by a waiter placing plates of perfectly prepared filet mignon before them. Eva turned to answer a question from one of the investors' wives, and the intimate moment was broken. For the rest of dinner, Bruno observed Eva as if seeing her for the first time, the way she elegantly held her silverware, how she tilted her head slightly when listening to a conversation partner, how her hands moved when she talked about her projects. He wondered how he could have stopped noticing all this. After dessert, the less formal part of the evening began. The string quartet gave way to a DJ who started playing elegant but more dynamic music. Some guests moved to the dance floor. Others gathered around the bar or dispersed through the room in smaller groups, having business and social conversations. Bruno was surrounded by a group of potential investors from Dubai interested in his latest office tower project in Chicago. For the next hour, he answered their questions, presented financial projections, discussed technical details. But all the while he watched Eva from the corner of his eye as she moved freely through the room, talking with various guests. At one point he saw Michael Nowicki approach her with 2 champagne glasses. He handed her one, then leaned in, saying something that made her nod. Together they headed toward the observation terrace that stretched along one of the ballroom walls, offering a spectacular view of nighttime Chicago. Bruno felt a sudden contraction in his stomach. He excused himself from the investors and headed in their direction, weaving between guests. When he reached the terrace exit, he stopped. Through the glass doors he could see Eva and Michael standing by the railing, talking animatedly. The man was pointing to something on the city panorama, and Eva was nodding, occasionally interjecting her own comments. There was nothing ambiguous in their posture. They looked like 2 professionals discussing a project. Still, Bruno felt growing jealousy. It wasn't even about a potential romantic involvement, but that this young architect could talk with Eva about her passion. He understood her language, appreciated her talent. Michael saw in her what Bruno had stopped noticing years ago. Bruno stood motionless, watching Eva and Michael through the glass door. Chicago lights reflected in the glass, overlaying their silhouettes like phantasmagoric shadows. Music from the ballroom reached him muffled, as if from another world. In that moment he felt strangely isolated, as if looking at his life from outside. After a moment's hesitation, he pushed the glass door and stepped onto the terrace. The cool autumn air hit his face, bringing clarity. Eva and Michael turned at the sound of the opening door. "Bruno!" Eva raised her eyebrows, surprised by his appearance. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, trying to sound natural. "I thought I'd join the conversation about the project." Michael nodded with a professional smile. "We were just discussing the possibility of incorporating a rainwater collection system into the Milwaukee project. Given the proximity to the lake, we could also use temperature differences to generate part of the energy." Bruno felt like an unprepared student in class. He knew the project's basic assumptions. After all, his company was financing the construction. But technical details were foreign to him. For years he'd been accustomed to delegating such matters to his experts, focusing exclusively on financial and image aspects. "That sounds interesting," he said, approaching closer. "What would be the additional costs of such a solution?" Michael gave a specific figure and investment return period, without hesitation. "With current energy prices, the system will pay for itself in 7 years, and then bring savings of about $100,000 annually." Michael did very detailed analyses, Eva added. He even factored in projected changes in energy and water prices for the next 15 years. Bruno was impressed, though he tried not to show it. The young architect clearly knew his work and could combine visionary approach with business pragmatism. "What about the visual aspect?" Bruno asked. "Our clients are paying for luxury apartments with lake views. We don't want the facade dominated by technical installations." Eva smiled slightly, as if she'd expected this question. I can show you. She reached into the small purse she was carrying and pulled out her phone. After a few touches of the screen, she showed him a three-dimensional model of the building. The system is integrated with the architecture, she explained, zooming in on the facade view. These elements that look like decorative panels are actually collectors, and rainwater storage tanks are hidden in the basements, and partially in landscape architecture elements around the building. Bruno examined the project with growing interest. It was truly impressive. It combined modern technological solutions with elegant, timeless design that referenced Milwaukee architecture without being a banal copy of historical buildings. "This is your project?" he asked, looking at Eva. "The overall concept is mine," she replied. But Michael added many valuable technical solutions and helped refine the details. Michael shook his head with a smile. "Don't diminish your contribution. You came up with the idea of hiding the collectors in a form referencing Milwaukee's port cranes. The competition committee was delighted with that." Bruno observed their interaction, this mutual appreciation, professional respect, shared language. He felt simultaneously proud of Eva and strangely excluded from her world. "The project is impressive," he admitted honestly. "I think we should increase the budget for its promotion. This could be our flagship investment for years to come." Eva looked at him with surprise, that after a moment transformed into cautious joy. This was the first time in months, maybe even years, that he'd truly appreciated her work. "I'm glad you like it," she said quietly. For a moment they stood in silence, looking at the Chicago panorama. Downtown skyscrapers glowed with thousands of windows, their reflections mirrored in the dark surface of Lake Michigan. Somewhere in the distance, the lights of a departing plane blinked. "I should probably get back to the guests," Michael finally said, sensing the tension between the spouses. "Mr. Wojciechowski, it was a pleasure to finally meet you. Eva, I'll see you tomorrow at the meeting with contractors." "Yes, 10 a.m. at the office," Eva confirmed. When Michael disappeared behind the glass doors, Bruno and Eva were left alone on the terrace. The cool wind moved her hair, and city lights reflected in her eyes. "Why did you never show me this project?" Bruno asked. Eva sighed, leaning against the railing. "I tried many times, but you were always busy with phone calls, meetings, business trips. Eventually I stopped trying." Bruno wanted to deny it, but he knew she was right. How many times had he pushed her aside, putting work above their relationship? How many times had he dismissed her when she tried to tell him about her projects? "That dress," he began, changing the subject. "You've never worn it before." Eva looked at him with slight surprise, then smiled sadly. "I bought it 3 months ago for the Architectural Awards Gala, where I was nominated. You were supposed to accompany me, but at the last moment you flew to Berlin." Bruno felt a stab of shame. He didn't remember any gala, any nomination. Had he really been that disconnected from her life? "Did you win?" he asked quietly. "Not the main prize. A distinction for innovation." She turned her gaze away, looking at the city. "Michael came to support me." Bruno felt a stab of jealousy, but this time different than before. It wasn't that some man was interested in his wife, but that someone else had been with her in an important moment of her life, a moment when he should have been by her side. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words sounded foreign in his mouth. He wasn't used to apologizing. "I should have been there." Eva looked at him searchingly, as if trying to assess the sincerity of his words. "Why now, Bruno? What changed? For the last 3 years you've practically not noticed me. We lived next to each other like roommates, and suddenly when I put on a red dress and talk to another man, you remember I exist." Her words were painful but true. Bruno wondered what he should answer. The truth was he himself didn't fully understand his feelings. The sight of Eva in that dress, confident, admired by others, awakened something in him that seemed long dormant. Desire, jealousy, but also a sense of loss. "I think I just forgot," he said finally. "I forgot how exceptional you are. I forgot why I fell in love with you." Eva was silent for a long while. Her profile stood out against the illuminated city like a classical sculpture, perfect but distant. "And I didn't forget," she finally said. "I remember the man who could talk with me for hours about his dreams, who appreciated my ideas, who looked at me like I was the most important person in the world. Where did he go? Bruno? Her question hung in the air between them. Bruno didn't have an answer for it, or at least not one that wouldn't sound like an excuse. The truth was he'd allowed success, money, and ambition to obscure what was truly important. I don't know, he admitted honestly, but I'd like to find him again, if you'll let me. Eva looked at him for a longer moment. Her eyes glistened with emotions Bruno couldn't fully read. It's not that simple, Bruno, she said finally. You can't expect everything to return to normal after one evening, after a few nice words. Too much has happened between us. Or rather, hasn't happened. From the ballroom came the sounds of a new song, a slow, romantic number as couples began to dance. Will you dance with me? Bruno asked, extending his hand toward her. Eva hesitated, but after a moment nodded slightly and accepted his hand. One dance, she said quietly. They returned to the room where the dance floor had already filled with dancing couples. Bruno embraced Eva at the waist, feeling the delicate material of her dress under his fingers. They moved slowly to the rhythm of the music, initially maintaining distance, as if they were strangers on a first date. The lights in the ballroom had been dimmed, creating an intimate atmosphere. Crystal chandeliers cast a delicate glow, their reflections shimmering on the walls like distant stars. Bruno held Eva in his arms, breathing in the familiar scent of her perfume, which now seemed simultaneously close and distant, like a memory from another life. With each beat of the music, the distance between them gradually decreased. Bruno felt the warmth of her body. He saw the tiny freckles on her nose that he hadn't noticed in years. Her eyes, when she looked at him, were full of conflicting emotions. Caution, melancholy, but also something that resembled longing. Do you remember our first dance? He asked quietly, leaning in so only she could hear him. Eva smiled slightly and a flash of memories appeared in her eyes. At our wedding, you chose that Frank Sinatra song we heard during our first date. The Way You Look Tonight, Bruno confirmed. You said then it was too obvious a choice, and you replied that some things are obvious. For good reason, Eva finished, and her voice became softer. Bruno felt a sting in his heart. He really had said that. He, the pragmatic businessman who usually avoided sentimental gestures, but back then, at the beginning of their relationship, he'd wanted everything to be perfect. Was it possible he'd changed so much along the way? Or rather, had what was always in him, ambition, drive for success, perfectionism, taken control over all other aspects of his personality. The music changed to another slow song, but they continued dancing, absorbed in their own microcosm amid the crowd of guests. What happened to us, Eva? Bruno asked, looking straight into her eyes. Eva took a deep breath, as if gathering her thoughts. I think we just stopped trying. You focused on building an empire. I, on my career. At first I tried to fight for our relationship, but each time I felt like I was losing to your meetings, phone calls, trips. Eventually I gave up. Why didn't you leave? He asked. Honestly, because he really wanted to know. Her eyes became suddenly more transparent, as if she herself was pondering that question. Partly from convenience, partly from habit. Our life, despite everything, followed a certain pattern that gave me freedom in professional development, she admitted. After a moment, she added more quietly. And maybe somewhere deep down I still had hope that one day you'd wake up and notice me again. Bruno felt his throat tighten. And is there still a chance for us? The question hung between them like a delicate thread that could break from the slightest gust. Eva was silent for a long while, leading him in a dance that had now become a pretext for prolonging this intimate conversation. I don't know, Bruno, she said finally. It's not like I stopped loving you from one day to the next. It was a gradual drifting apart, until one day I realized we were living next to each other, not with each other. You can rebuild a bridge, but it requires effort from both sides. Bruno nodded, understanding the weight of her words. For years he'd been accustomed to achieving goals through persistence, money, power, but none of those tools worked in interpersonal relationships, especially in love. I'm ready to try, he said, feeling these words were truer than anything he'd said in recent years. I'm not asking for an immediate answer. Just give me a chance to show you I can be a different person. The music slowly quieted. They stopped in the middle of the dance floor. They stood like that for a while, still in each other's arms, as if neither wanted to break this moment and return to reality. "Sorry to interrupt." They suddenly heard Andrew Kowalski's voice, who appeared beside them with a champagne glass in hand. "Bruno, the investors from Dubai are asking for you. I think you owe them a few more details about the office tower project." Bruno sighed, reluctantly releasing his arms. "I'll be right there," he said to his friend, then turned to Ava. "I need to handle this. Will you wait for me?" Ava nodded. "I'll be at the bar." Bruno headed toward the group of businessmen in traditional Arab attire, feeling her gaze on him. The conversation with the investors dragged on. They had many questions about legal aspects of the investment, potential risks, project timeline. In the past, Bruno would have been completely absorbed in such a conversation, feeling excitement about another big project. Now, however, his thoughts kept returning to Ava. Every so often he glanced toward the bar where she sat, talking with the wife of one of his business partners. In the red dress, she stood out from other guests like a flame. Bruno wondered how he could have not noticed her for so long. This intelligent, beautiful woman, who had once been the center of his world. After almost 40 minutes, he finally managed to end the conversation and headed toward her. But when he reached the bar, Ava was no longer there. He looked around the room but didn't see her anywhere. "Looking for your wife?" asked Caroline, his assistant, who appeared beside him with a tablet in hand, ready as always to take his orders. "Yes. Have you seen her?" "She left about 15 minutes ago. She looked tired. She asked me to tell you she'd take a taxi home." Bruno felt disappointment. Was this her way of avoiding further conversation? Or was she really tired and didn't want to disturb him with business? "I need to go," he said to Caroline. "Make sure all guests are satisfied and tell the organizers everything went perfectly." Without waiting for an answer, Bruno headed to the exit. He handed the valet his ticket, and after a few minutes, he was sitting in his Mercedes, heading toward their home in Wilmette. The entire drive seemed longer than usual. The buildings he passed, illuminated streets, Chicago's nightlife, it all now seemed just background for his thoughts about Eva. He wondered what he'd say when he got home. Should he continue their conversation? Or maybe give her time, space? When he finally parked in front of their residence, he noticed the bedroom light was on. That was a good sign. She hadn't gone to bed yet. Bruno took a deep breath and got out of the car. The house greeted him with silence. In the hall, only the ticking of an old clock could be heard, the one Ava had bought at a flea market in Paris during their first trip together. Bruno removed his coat and headed upstairs, feeling a strange tension, as if returning after a long absence. The bedroom door was ajar. Bruno knocked gently and looked inside. Eva sat before her vanity, brushing her long blonde hair. She'd already removed her makeup and the red dress. Now she wore a silk robe in ivory. In the soft light of the bedside lamp, she looked younger, more vulnerable. "May I come in?" Bruno asked, standing in the doorway. Eva turned and nodded. She set down the brush and looked at him questioningly. "Why did you leave early?" he asked, approaching closer. "You were busy. I didn't want to disturb you," she replied, but there was no reproach in her voice, only fatigue. "I'm sorry. I should have ended that conversation sooner. That's your job, Bruno. I understand that." Silence fell, during which they looked at each other, as if trying to read each other's thoughts. "You were the most beautiful woman in the room today," Bruno said finally. "Everyone admired you, not just for your appearance, but for your intelligence, competence." Eva smiled, slightly. "Thank you. It's nice to hear those words, especially from you." Bruno sat on the edge of the bed, feeling strangely uncertain in his own bedroom. "I was serious about wanting to change, Eva, about wanting to rebuild what was between us." Eva sighed, turning toward him. "Bruno, I appreciate what you're saying. I really do. But at the same time, I'm afraid this is just a momentary impulse, a reaction to someone else paying attention to me." "It's not like that," he denied quickly. "It is. Not because I'd be romantically interested in Michael, but because his presence in my professional life reminded you of my existence," Eva said calmly, without accusations in her voice. "And this dress, which I chose consciously today, I wanted to test whether you'd even see me." Bruno thought about her words. Was that really how it was? Did he need an external impulse to see what he was losing every day? "Maybe you're right," he admitted honestly. "Maybe I needed such a wake-up call, but That doesn't change the fact that my feelings are real and that I truly want to repair our marriage." Ava stared at him for a long while, as if searching for something in his eyes. Sincerity, determination, love. "What are you proposing?" she finally asked. Bruno smiled with relief. The very fact that she asked that question gave him hope. "Let's start from the beginning. Tomorrow I have a board meeting, but I'm free in the afternoon. Maybe we could go together for lunch or a walk by the lake. I'd like to hear about your projects, about that award you got, about everything I've missed in recent years." "That's a good start," Eva nodded. "But Bruno, this requires time and consistency. You can't go back to old habits after a week or a month." "I know, and I'm ready for that. I'm aware that trust needs to be rebuilt, and that doesn't happen overnight." Eva stood and walked to the window, looking at the garden shrouded in darkness. The moon illuminated the lawn and roses she'd planted herself when they moved into this house. "You know," she began quietly, "when I bought that dress, I was thinking about you. I wondered if you'd like it, if you'd notice the difference. Then I decided it was naive, that you probably wouldn't even look my way." "And yet I looked," Bruno said. Ava turned slowly. They now stood face to face, so close that Bruno could see golden reflections in her blue eyes. "We'll do this step by step," she said with a delicate smile. "We'll see where it takes us." Bruno felt his heart accelerate. There was more hope in her words than he dared expect. Slowly, cautiously, as if afraid of scaring her away, he reached out and touched her cheek. Her skin was warm and soft under his fingers. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for a second chance." Eva tilted her head slightly, leaning her cheek against his palm. "You haven't earned it yet," she replied, but a playful gleam appeared in her eyes that he hadn't seen in years. "But you have time to do so." Bruno smiled, feeling a surge of tenderness and gratitude. He knew that much work awaited him, many changes in his own approach to life, to priorities. But for the first time in years, he felt he had something more important ahead of him than another contract or investment. "What do you say to breakfast tomorrow morning before my meeting? I could get up earlier and prepare it," he proposed. Eva raised her eyebrows with surprise. "You would prepare breakfast? Why not? I used to do it. Remember? Those Sundays when I'd bring you coffee and toast in bed?" "I remember." Her smile became warmer. "That sounds good, as long as you don't burn down the kitchen." "I can't promise anything," Bruno laughed, "but I'll try." They stood like that for a while, enjoying the regained closeness, though both knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were many obstacles to overcome, many habits to change, many conversations to have. But the most important thing was that they both wanted to try. That night, as they lay in bed, still on opposite sides but no longer as distant as before, Bruno thought about the red dress now hanging in Eva's closet. That dress reminded him who his wife truly was, a strong, independent woman he should never have stopped admiring. And though initially it was jealousy that attracted his attention, now he felt primarily pride and gratitude. "Good night, Eva," he whispered into the darkness. "Good night, Bruno," she replied, and in her voice was the promise of a tomorrow that could be the beginning of something new. Silence filled the bedroom, interrupted only by their breathing and the distant hum of the city. Outside the window, Chicago glittered with thousands of lights, and for the first time in years, falling asleep, they thought about the same thing, the chance to rebuild what had almost been lost. The red dress had fulfilled its purpose. It not only attracted the billionaire's attention to his wife, but above all reminded him that the greatest value isn't money, power, or professional success, but love that had patiently waited all this time to finally be rediscovered. If this story touched you, remember, sometimes the person you're ignoring is the one who could complete you. Share this with someone who needs to hear that success means nothing if you lose the person who believed in you from the start. That jealousy isn't love, but it can be the alarm that wakes you up. That your partner's professional achievements aren't competition, but proof of their extraordinary nature. And that sometimes all it takes is one red dress, one party, and the courage to admit you've been blind. Subscribe if you believe in marriages that get second chances when both people decide to fight. In husbands who finally see their wives as partners, not accessories. In the power of professional recognition to remind someone of their worth. And in the radical idea that the person standing behind you might be the one who should be standing beside you. Because Sometimes all it takes is watching your wife shine in another man's conversation to realize you've been taking the sun for granted.